On August 20th and the 21st of 1910, the most devastating forest fire ever recorded in the United States raged out of control and was poised to burn the mining town of Wallace, Idaho to the ground. For months, hundreds of fires had burned throughout the northern Rockies in eastern Washington, North Idaho, and western Montana. Then, on Saturday, August the 20th, a weather system pushed through the area, creating hurricane-force winds which caused all of these separate fires to become one. For 36 hours, the fire burned, destroying entire towns like Taft, Montana, and Grand Forks, Idaho. The fire covered about the same square mileage as the state of Connecticut. Between 85 to 90 people were killed. Most of them were firefighters. By the afternoon of the 20th, the massive fire was within miles of Wallace. Everyone knew it was coming. They could see the flames on the south and on the east. Then in the evening, the fire hit the east end of Wallace. The town's survival seemed impossible. The following is the recollections of a man who lived in Wallace during that summer. Arthur H. Fay, his wife Mabel, and their 2 children, Adelaide and Clark, called Wallace home. Arthur worked at the local laundry and was the Sunday school superintendent of the Congregational Church, and he was also an avid photographer. Though photography was a hobby for him, many of the photographs of Wallace from 1900 through 1910 were taken by him. Historic Wallace Preservation Society is proud to have a portion of his collection. The following accounts he gives was made sometime in the late 1950s. At the time of the fire, he was 29 years old. 44 years later, his daughter, Adelaide, urged him to recount the events of that fire. At the age of 73 and in failing health, he recalled the events and shared with her what he could remember. This is an abridged version. In his original recounting, he included events that happened after the fire, before he talked about the fire. The events have been rearranged to maintain the timeline. His recollections are placed in a narrative order, focusing on the story surrounding the fire, and taking care not to change any of his original intent. The original version was presented to Historic Wallace Preservation Society by George Hypes in 1988. George was the son of Gordon and Adelaide Fay Hypes. Adelaide was Arthur's daughter. We are grateful for his contribution.
The fires around Wallace burned most of the summer, starting in late June. Sometimes the fires were large, sometimes they were small. Some were very close to town, and others were much further away. There were firefighters in the woods all the time, but they just couldn't get the fires out. They would think they had it out, and then a strong wind would come up and start it all over again. And when the fire started merging and got closer to town, the sidewalks would be covered with ashes. Every morning it would look like it had been snowing. And the insides of our houses all smelled of smoke all the time. And sometimes the smoke was so thick it smarted the eyes and made one cough. Almost every day I'd see a wagon come into town with the body of a firefighter on it. And as things got worse, I remember one wagon had 5 bodies on it. And by now the sun looked yellow, just like a big orange. You could look right at it with the naked eye. And at night the sky was lit up with a bright red glow. We knew it was coming. Everybody just wondered if the fire would reach town before the morning. In August, I buried a couple of boxes of our belongings in the yard and covered them up with about 6 inches of dirt. I also filled up a couple of trunks and sent them to Spokane, about 100 miles away, and that's where my brother, mother, and sister lived. By the 20th of August, things were getting pretty hot. The prevailing winds were coming out of the southwest, and that's where most of the fires were. We lived on King Street, which was the furthest southwest of the city center. Now, King Street was a narrow canyon with a row of houses on one side and another row on the other. And there was a stream that ran behind one row of houses. And on the 20th, Saturday, several firefighters were all heading up King Street. They lit a backfire on each side of the canyon about 100 yards above the houses. The backfires are what saved the west end of Wallace. When the main fire hit the backfire, it split in half and went up both sides of the canyon. There was a ballpark about 5 or 6 blocks away from where we lived. And that afternoon, people began removing the furniture from their houses and stacking it in the park. And all the time we could tell the fire was getting closer. By 3 o'clock, the one road that ran out of Wallace was busy. Everybody who owned a horse and rig was leaving down that road. And at the time, I was working for a laundry. I hurried and made all my deliveries before 5, and I put the horse and wagon in the livery barn where we kept it. The last time I ever saw that horse and wagon, it was going down the road as its owner wasn't going to leave it in the city. I went home and we made plans to evacuate on the emergency train. Mabel, the children, and myself would leave on one of the last trains heading west. The train was steaming up and it was preparing to pull out, so we went to a spot near the depot and waited with 100 other people. And around 9 p.m., the wind picked up and blew in a firebrand, and it lit the building beside the one we were waiting in. At the time, everyone began to board the train, and it pulled out of town around 9:30. And that train took us about 12 miles down the canyon, and there it unloaded everybody. We had a friend who lived there who had an extra bed, so Mabel, myself, and the 2 children, Adelaide and Clark, we all had a bed for the night. Many people didn't. There was another train that pulled out of Wallace heading east to Missoula. It had been loaded with patients from the hospital. We heard of a train once it left Avery that it was crossing bridges and trestles that were on fire. They found that the trestles in front of them had burned away, so they couldn't go any further. And the ones they had just crossed were now collapsing. They put the train in a tunnel and tried to wait it out. And for days they couldn't go forward or backward. The train was thought to have been lost in the fire, and there was no way for the people on the train to communicate to the station, and no way could any rescuers go search for the train. The following day, Sunday, August 21st, was my birthday. A train that was made up of only boxcars was leaving for Wallace, so I boarded it with a lot of other people. We were a motley crowd of refugees that was returning to a decimated city. Mabel and the children boarded a train that would take them to the steamboat, and from there they would go to Coeur d'Alene and then to Spokane, where my brother would pick them up and take them home. In Wallace, the entire east side of the town was completely burned out. The large Samuel still stood just across the street from where the fire had been stopped, though most of the windows were broken out from the heat of the fire. I knew of only one man on the west side that had been killed. He had returned to his house to rescue a pet parrot, and they found him dead the next day on his lawn, where he had died of suffocation. I stayed in Wallace a few days and found someone to buy our furniture and other things. A man who had lost everything gave me $100 for it all, including the house rent, which we had already paid up. He moved in the next day with everything to go right on living. Even the groceries we had in the house had been included. And on Thursday, I boarded a train for Spokane. I left a lot of good friends behind, many who had worked with me in the Sunday school. And most of those friends I've never seen in the 44 years since that horrible fire.
Last year, careless tourists and campers destroyed millions of acres of valuable timber, watershed, and recreational areas because they forgot to be careful with matches, smokes, and campfires. When you go hunting, fishing, on a picnic, or maybe just a drive through our forest area, please be extra careful with fire. Drown that campfire. Break those matches. Don't throw that smoke out the car window. Use the ashtray. Make sure every spark is out. Help keep America green. As Smokey the Bear says, remember, folks, only you can prevent forest fires.
This has been an ABC Television Network film presentation.